Imagine a king, cloaked in robes of power, yet terrified of the slightest touch. A ruler who believed his very body was made of fragile glass, threatening to shatter into a million pieces. This isn't a fairy tale. It was the tragic reality for King Charles VI of France, whose madness would nearly break his kingdom. In 1380, a young boy ascended the French throne, full of promise and vigor. He was Charles VI, and his people would soon name him Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved. His early reign was marked by decisiveness, as he cast off the greedy influence of his uncles and sought to rule in his own right. This sparked hope for a new golden age for France. But a darkness was lurking within the king's mind, a fragile crack that would soon splinter. It would plunge both the man and his kingdom into one of the most terrifying periods of their history. The year is 1392, and the summer sun beats down on the royal procession traveling through the forest of Le Mans. The king was leading an army to punish a nobleman who had attempted to assassinate his chief advisor. Suddenly, a gaunt, barefoot leper darted from the trees, grabbing the king's bridle. He cried out, "Ride no further, noble king, you are betrayed." The warning, though dismissed, planted a seed of paranoia in the king's feverish mind. Moments later, a page, drowsy from the heat, accidentally dropped a steel lance against a helmet with a loud clang. The sharp sound shattered the king's sanity completely. Believing he was under attack, Charles drew his sword and let out a blood-curdling scream of "Treason! On the traitors!" He charged wildly, his eyes devoid of recognition, cutting down his own knights in a frenzy of paranoia. He even lunged at his own brother, Louis of Orléans, before he could be subdued. After a violent struggle, the king's chamberlain finally managed to wrestle him to the ground, where he fell into a deep coma. The promising reign of Charles the Well-Beloved was effectively over. When Charles awoke, the madness had receded, but it had left a permanent scar on his psyche. He was horrified by the carnage he had caused, knowing his mind was no longer his own. His lucid periods grew shorter, and the episodes of insanity became more frequent and bizarre. For the rest of his long life, he would oscillate between being a capable monarch and a man lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. During his worst fits, he would fail to recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau, and his own children. He would demand to know who these strangers were who had invaded his chambers. He would sometimes howl like a wolf for hours on end. At other times, he would run uncontrollably through the vast corridors of his Parisian residence, the Hôtel Saint-Paul. His attendants were eventually forced to wall up the entrances to his quarters. This was the only way to prevent him from escaping and harming himself or others during his violent outbursts. It was during this period that his most famous affliction emerged, the glass delusion. Charles became utterly convinced that his entire body was made of delicate glass, liable to shatter at the slightest impact. This rare psychiatric condition, which modern historians have retrospectively analyzed, defined the terror of his daily existence. He lived in constant fear of being broken. He refused to be touched and would fly into a rage if anyone came too close, fearing they might shatter him. He had special clothing made with iron rods sewn into the fabric to protect his fragile form from accidental collisions. For hours, even days on end, he would sit perfectly still in one place. He was terrified that any sudden movement would cause him to break into 1,000 tiny pieces. The fragility of his mind was tragically mirrored by a horrific real-world event in 1393. To celebrate a wedding, the court held a masquerade known as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. The king and 5 of his companions dressed as wild men of the forest. Their costumes were made of linen soaked in resinous wax with frayed hemp attached to simulate fur, making them incredibly flammable. They were chained together, capering and howling for the amusement of the court. The king's brother, Louis of Orléans, arrived late with his entourage, carrying lit torches to see the spectacle. In the dim hall, he came too close to the dancers, and a spark from a torch ignited one of the costumes. Within seconds, all the men were engulfed in a terrifying inferno. The king was saved only because his young aunt, the Duchess of Berry, threw her voluminous skirt over him, smothering the flames. 4 of the other men burned to death in agony before the horrified court. The trauma of the event sent Charles spiraling back into a severe bout of madness that lasted for months. The incident deepened the nation's despair, confirming their king was truly cursed. With a king who was often legally and mentally incapacitated, France was left rudderless. A bitter power vacuum emerged, creating a vicious struggle for control of the kingdom. The royal court quickly split into 2 warring factions, each vying for supremacy. The nation's leadership was paralyzed by infighting. On one side were the Armagnacs, led by the king's ambitious brother, Louis of Orléans. They were later headed by his father-in-law, Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac. On the other side were the Burgundians, led by the king's powerful uncle, Philip the Bold. He was succeeded by his calculating and ruthless son, John the Fearless. This rivalry wasn't just political. It was a deeply personal feud fueled by greed and ambition. It would tear the nation apart from within. In 1407, the feud reached its bloody climax when John the Fearless ordered the brutal assassination of his cousin, Louis of Orléans. Louis was ambushed and hacked to death in the streets of Paris. This single act of political murder plunged France into a full-blown civil war. The nation's nobles were forced to choose sides, butchering one another while their mad king sat vacant on the throne. Across the English Channel, England's new king, the young and ambitious Henry V, watched the chaos in France with keen interest. He saw a nation paralyzed by internal conflict and ruled by a broken monarch. For Henry, this was a divine opportunity to press his own claim to the French throne. For Henry, this was a divine opportunity to press his own claim to the French throne. He decided to reignite the conflict that would become known as the 100 Years' War. In 1415, Henry V landed in Normandy with a relatively small but disciplined army. The French nobility, though deeply divided by their civil war, mustered a massive force to confront him. They met the English invaders near a small village called Agincourt. Despite outnumbering the English several times over, the French were overconfident, arrogant, and disorganized. The result was one of the most catastrophic defeats in French military history. The muddy field, combined with the devastating power of the English longbow, turned the battle into a slaughterhouse. The heavy French knights became bogged down in the mud, making them easy targets for English archers. Their charge was a disastrous failure. Thousands of French nobles, the very heart of the nation's chivalry and leadership, were killed or captured. The defeat at Agincourt left France utterly defenseless and leaderless. The crushing defeat shattered what little unity remained in France. In the ensuing chaos, the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, saw their chance. They seized control of Paris and, in a shocking move, aligned themselves with the victorious English. This alliance would lead to the single most humiliating moment in the country's history. In 1420, under the influence of his wife, Queen Isabeau, and the powerful Burgundians, Charles VI was made to sign the Treaty of Troyes. He was likely in a suggestible state, if not completely insane. In this treaty, the King of France formally disinherited his own son and heir, the Dauphin Charles. The document declared the Dauphin illegitimate and unworthy of the crown. It instead named his sworn enemy, Henry V of England, as his regent and successor to the French throne. The kingdom was essentially being handed over to foreign rule. To seal the pact, Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, was married to Henry V. It seemed that the centuries-old dream of an English king ruling both England and France was about to become a reality. The Kingdom of France had effectively been signed away by its own mad monarch. The French people felt a profound sense of betrayal and despair. In a bizarre twist of fate, the seemingly invincible Henry V died unexpectedly from dysentery in August 1422. His death came just 2 months before that of the man he was set to succeed. The Mad King, Charles VI, finally passed away in October 1422. He died unloved and largely forgotten by his court, who had long since abandoned him to his illness. He was laid to rest with little ceremony, a tragic and lonely end for the man once hailed as the well-beloved. His 42-year reign had been one of immense suffering for both himself and his people. Upon his death, the infant son of Henry V and Catherine, Henry II, was proclaimed King of England and France. The English occupation of northern France seemed secure, but in the south, the disinherited Dauphin refused to accept his father's treaty. From his court in Bourges, he declared himself King Charles XI of France. France now had two kings, and the long, brutal war for its soul entered its final, desperate phase. The country was fractured, demoralized, and on the brink of collapse. It would be a teenage peasant girl from a remote village who would change the course of history. Joan of Arc emerged, claiming divine guidance to rally the fractured French forces. She inspired the armies of Charles VII, turning the tide of the war and leading France towards an ultimate, improbable victory. But that victory was built upon the ashes of a kingdom nearly destroyed by the madness of its king. The reign of Charles VI is a chilling tale of how the fate of a nation can be tied to the fragile mind of a single individual. His glass delusion was a symptom of a deeper illness that created a power vacuum, fueled a bloody civil war, and left France vulnerable to its greatest enemy. The story of the Mad King is not just a bizarre historical footnote. It is a profound lesson on the devastating consequences of leadership collapsing from within, plunging a great kingdom into darkness and despair. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Past Agenda and support us. The visuals within this presentation are crafted to enrich your understanding, serving as artistic interpretations and contextual aids rather than direct factual representations. Their purpose is to illuminate the narrative and deepen your engagement with the historical backdrop. Join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support keeps history alive.